Okay, on the shark bite, which questions did we want to see, go over, have questions about? Three. Any others?
5, I guess.
Okay. All right, so for 3, you're looking for the domain and range of this discrete graph. It's not continuous because they're random points. So when you list out your domain and range, they'll be in curly brackets, least to greatest with no repeat. So domain would be -3, -1, 0, and 3. And then your range, again, least to greatest would be -1, 0, 2, 3. So look for domain, look for your x values. What your x values are at each of those points. Least to greatest. And then same thing for your range, but y values, lowest to highest. Other questions on that one? Five, you may have seen before, you may have not seen before, so that's fine. It's comparing two equations. This first one, which is always going to be the one you compare it to the second one. Anytime it's talking about shifted up or shifted down, that's comparing your y-intercept. So it started at 0 and went up 2, so then shifted up. And then the part B is comparing your slopes. This was at 1, now it's at -1/2, so that's less than that. So it'd be less. Questions on it? So in these notes, there we go. We did the first page. Flip to the next page. We're gonna go over any questions you guys want to see, go over, have questions about on 4, 5, or 6, and then move on. Are there any of those 3 we want to see, go over, do have questions about?
It's on this one, right? The quadratic. One. That's
Not that one, the other one. Do we want to see any of those 3?
yeah, why not?
Okay, 6, algebraically in the graph or in the table.
Right.
Okay. So if you don't have your calculator, you need that, go grab it. Eva, do you guys have your calculators? You're gonna put first reset your calculator, second plus 712. That should say 712. And it didn't. Do all those numbers. Second plus 7, 1, 2. Then you're gonna put the equation for number 6 into y equals, so go ahead and go to your y equals. And type in that equation.
Wait, we're doing number 6, right?
6, yeah.
Oh.
Did you say a different number? Okay.
And I thought we were doing number 4. for some
Oh.
reason.
Right, and then we're doing this by the graph, so go ahead and graph it. And remember, our goal is to find solutions. How many solutions does this have? What are they?
Let's say heroes on the middle. And
One of them, yeah.
then also 2, 2, 0.
So you could write them as order pairs or in solution set. As a solution set. So we would write 0, 0 and 2, 0, or x equals in curly brackets 0. Then we're gonna graph it just for good practice on graphing. So the vertex here is in between those 2 points. At 1, 3. So that's gonna be our point in the middle. You can fill out your x's, go forward and backwards. We know at 0 and 2, those y values are both 0. Then to find our y values of the other 2, you can either find 3 or 4 or -1 and -2. So if you go into second trace and find your value, you can put in any of those 4 numbers. So I'm going to put in 3. And it should tell you what your y value is, -9. And that's going to repeat at -1. And then do the same thing to find the missing one. So put in -2 or 4. The second trace again. Yeah. Value. And then 4 or -2. At this point, we won't be able to graph, but still fill out your table. So we're only going to graph -1, -9 to 3, -9. So go ahead and plot those points. And it should look something like that.
Just be sure that's it, right?
Mhm.
Oh.
Any others we want to see, go over, have questions on before we move on? If not, go on to the next page. Right, so on this page, this is gonna help you with the Khan Academy quizzes that are due on Friday. Being able to recognize what your roots or your solutions look like in factored form. So we're going to find the solutions first. I know the graph is really small, but what would your two solutions be here?
-4, 0.
And I'm gonna just write it as x equals 4, but you could write it as -4, 0, that would be fine. Negative, not positive. Any other?
2.
So when we write this as factored form, it's gonna be the opposite of whatever the sign is. So if it says -4, you're gonna write it as x plus 4. If it says +2, you're gonna write it as x minus 2.
Why?
I'm gonna explain that in 1 second. So this next part is not necessary, but if you wanted to see what this actual equation is, that's what this space is for, you could distribute this out. So this would be x squared minus 2x plus 4x minus 8. And then we would combine those like terms. So this would be a good way to check yourself. Did you get the right solutions by distributing, putting this back into standard form, graphing that to see if your solutions and graph match? But that's not a necessary step. To know why we write it backwards, we're gonna take each of those factors and set them equal to 0. Write this somewhere off to the side. Then we're gonna solve both of them. So when we write them in factored form, they're written with opposite signs, because if they were set equal to 0, we would want to get the actual zeros. If we put the opposite, so if we put exactly what it says inside the factored form, if we went to solve it, it would be the opposite, and that's not what we want. So we always put the opposite. So really, you just need to know how to find the zeros and put them in factored form. So we're gonna practice that. Before we do two, what questions do we have? What are your zeros for 2? They're really close together. 7 and 8. So then how would we write those in factored form? X minus 7 and x minus 8. So as long as you know you have to do the opposite when you write it in factored form, you'll be okay.
Okay.
If we were to set both factors equal to 0, we would solve them and get the 2 that we originally wrote, which is what we want. What would the zeros for 3 be?
-3. -3, -8. Then it would just be x, x plus 8, and x plus 3.
X plus 8, x plus 3. And then on the last one, the zeros there. -1 and what was the other one? 5.
So then it would be x minus 5. X plus 5, right?
Yes.
Okay. I am gonna show you a couple of the problems on Khan Academy, how it'll look, because there's a slight difference of solid.
Questions on this before we do that? I would say find some blank space somewhere in your notes. There might be a blank sheet somewhere in there. I don't know between what we missed. So this is the in factor form. The questions are all different. Sometimes you're given a graph, sometimes you have to graph the points, sometimes you're not given either of those. It depends. So here, this is asking what the equation of P would be. You need to look at the zeros, look at the solutions, and figure out which ones match. So first, let's figure out what the zeros are.
-3 is 1 of them. -1. Wouldn't. I can't tell if that's on 1 or 1.5.
It's half. Okay, so the ones that are on whole numbers are gonna be just like what we were just doing. But opposite, so the one that says +3 and +1. So it's gonna be A or B in this case. We just need to figure out which of the others it is. So what you're gonna do is take this piece, set it equal to 0. And see if you get the remaining 0 or not. Is A our answer?
Yes. No, wait, I don't know. Maybe?
Is this -1/2?
No.
So not that one, so it would have to be this one. If you wanted to do the work and double check it, you could do it, but because we eliminated our options, it should be that one. Because we would have to add one to both sides. And we'd end up with a positive. So it should be.
So these are really, do you know what the factor form looks like? Are you able to solve it? Set it equal to 0 and solve it and find the 0. If you can do that, then you're good.
What's the other one?
I'm gonna show you those.
It's basically the same thing, but they just give you the factor form. And it may be simple enough, like the x + 4, we know that would be the opposite, so -4. The other one, you would just have to take it, set it equal to 0 and solve. We did this, we'll do it again. And then the lesser would just be which is smaller between the two.
Greater would be which one's bigger.
And I just realized that. You guys can't see this. I meant to zoom this back. Out. My bad.
It'll be -4 will be the lesser edge.
Mm-hmm.
1.5 would be the greater edge. Oh.
So if you know what the factor forms look like, you can solve it, then you'll do fine. But if you need my help when you have time to practice, let me know.
Questions on the Khan Academy? We're gonna do one last thing and then be done for today.
Start the last lesson, do some problems from that, and then be done for today.
to recap all of our lessons so far, we talked about. Our first lesson was how we solve quadratics from square roots. Then we talked about how to graph quadratics, how to find the solutions. This last section is another form of how to solve. So there are different ways to solve them. We're not talking about all of them. In algebra 2, you go on to talk about all, if not most of them. Another method would be to solve by factoring, which we're not doing. We factored, but we're not solving by factoring. This would be if you couldn't factor, what you would do.
Go, you good memorize that?
Not in this class, in algebra 2, you will.
Okay.
So it would be good practice to start memorizing it because you'll need it. So for this, the very first thing we're gonna do is make sure two things, that this is in the format ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And if that is the case, label your A, B, and C. That will help you when we get into doing the formula, so you know which ones are which. You may need more paper than what's up here, so feel free to grab some if you run out of space. So then once we have them labeled, we're just gonna put everything into the formula. X equals negative b, but it's already negative, so put 2 negatives. Later, when we get into the hang of this, we can simplify some steps earlier on, but for now, we'll do everything. Plus or minus the square root of
-6.
-6 or b squared. I'm gonna use parentheses. The -4 will always be there. Then you're multiplying a, which is 1, c, which is 4. And that's all over 2 times a. From there, we just start to simplify. In each step, make sure you have x equals. So this would become a positive 6 plus or minus. -6 squared is what?
36.
Positive 36. You can multiply these 3 numbers at the same time, so it's -4 times 1 times 4,
Would that be 16?
-16.
Yeah.
So it's getting a little simpler, but not there yet. Subtract 36 and 16. 20. Then the next part, we have to see, is 20 a perfect square? So if you're not sure, you can use your calculator and do second mode to get out of this. And it's in blue here, so second x squared. Put in 20, see if you get a whole number. So we are not simplifying radicals. Later, you'll do that. So you can just leave it as is. And you're gonna separate it and write it as 2 separate things. In your set notation, you're gonna do the minus version and the plus version.
And that's my answer.
If you wanted to write the decimals, you could also do that, and I'll show you how to do that.
So you would take that entire thing and put it all in together. So I'm gonna do it as a fraction. And type in 6 minus the square root of 20 all over 2. You'll get some set of decimals. You can do 2 to 3. And then do the same thing but plus. And you would write those sets of decimals instead. So 0.7645236.
In this, do we round it, or do we just keep?
Round to 2 or 3. 2 or 3, that's all. I put 2 and I was like, that's something. You can write it either way.
I would say putting in everything is an extra step, so you don't need to do that. But if you want the decimals instead, go for it. What questions do we have on that process before we do another?
It seems simple for now.
The hardest part is just simplifying everything.
Let's do number 1. Same thing. This is in the correct format, so this is A, B, C.
And then we're gonna put it into the formula.
So X equals negative B, year 10, plus or minus the square root of 10 squared. You can put parentheses or leave them off, it's not negative, so it doesn't matter. Minus 4 times A times C. All over 2A. Once you get the hang of this, if you had 2 negatives in the front and you want to go ahead and make it a positive first, that's fine. If you want to go ahead and figure out what the square, whatever squared is and put that in, you can do that as you get more comfortable with this. I'm still gonna write out the step. So then 10 squared would be what?
100,
Negative 4 times 1 times negative 2 would be what?
8 of the negative.
That's 8, yep. And then if we add those 2 together, is 108 a perfect square?
Will we get a whole number if we type it in?
So then it would be just like that one, we would separate it and write them as 2 separate. So negative 10 minus the square root of 108 over 2 and negative 10 plus the square root of 108 over 2. Or you can do the decimals, which I'm not doing.
Questions on that one?
Yeah, really. This is not a lot of space.
So yeah, feel free to grab extra paper if you need it. Okay. What is different about number 2's equation from what we've been doing?
It's not in the. Okay, thing.
So we have to get rid of the 4x by moving it to the other side. When you move it to the other side, it's still going to be in the A, B, C format, so it would go in the middle.
And then you can label and start the process.
So then we can start to put them in the formula. X equals negative B, it was already negative though. Plus or minus the square root of B squared. If you wanted to go ahead and change that, you could. Minus 4 times 1 times negative 11. All over 2A. And then start to simplify. So this would be +4 plus or minus the square root of -4 squared would give us what?
6. Positive 16?
+16. -4 times 1 times -11 would be a +44. We add 16 and 44, we would get what?
60?
60. Is that a perfect square?
No.
No. So that's gonna stay the same. 4 minus the square root of 60 all over 2 and 4 plus.
What would we do for number 3 first?
Move the 20 over by doing what? When we do that, that's gonna go last. X squared minus 8x minus 20 equals 0. Then label your A, B, and C values. And start your process. So we have negative B, but it's already negative, plus or minus the square root of -8 squared minus 4 times 1 times -20 all over 2 times A. We have +8 plus or minus. This would give us 64. This would give us a +80. We add those together, we would get what?
$144.
Is that a perfect square? Yes. What would that become? 12. So this is where there's more steps, we just have to keep simplifying, because this becomes 8 plus or minus 12.
To which we would now separate it and figure out what those two things are.
We have 8 minus 12 over 2 and 8 plus 12 over 2.
And I'm gonna continue this on the side because you're in space.
So the 8 minus 12 would give us -4. It would still be over 2, or you can put this all in after you separate it and simplify all together. 8 plus 12 would give us 20.
What would those two answers be?
-4 divided by 2 and 20 divided by 2. -2 and +10 would be your final.
So if you get a perfect square, you have to keep going. Simplify it as much as you can until you can't anymore. Questions on that one? We're gonna do 2 more and be done for today.
Let's do 4. This one's already in the right format, so you can label A, B, C. Set it up. X equals -B plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Then we can start to simplify. 5 plus or minus square root of 25 plus what's -4 times 1 times
-36.
144.
then 25 plus 144 is 169 a perfect square.
13.
X equals 5 plus or minus 13 over 2, so we would write that as two separate things. I'm gonna write this in 6 spot. So 5 minus 13 over 2 and 5 plus 13 over 2.
Figure out what those two solutions would be. That would be the numerator, you still have to divide by 2.
So, can one of them be a -4?
Questions on that?
Last one. 4, 5 is already in the format, so label A, B, and C. Start to put it in your format. I'm gonna maybe skip some stuff. So x equals -6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared would give us 36. Minus 4 times 1 times 7. All over 2 times 1. Which would just be 2.
What all of that would be?
This would just be -40. 36 minus 40. And then we have a negative.
-4.
Do you remember what happens when we have a negative underneath the square root?
It's 0.
It's not 0. 1. Not 1.
I'm like not answerable.
Okay, it, no solution.
Yeah, that's what it's about.
So when you get a negative underneath the square root, be careful because you may have gotten it by accident. Double check your math. And then once you've double checked it, if it's a true negative, at this point you can stop. There'll be no solution. Questions on this process? So it doesn't get harder than what we've discussed. So Friday, we're gonna go over any questions you guys want to go over, and then you'll have time to practice more / do the review. But today you can work on practice from these notes, practice from the solution notes, Khan Academy, that's due on Friday, past Khan Academy.
We do the one you said next week.
You could, you may need my help to check some of them because they simplify some of them in a way we didn't talk about.
I'll wait till next week.
Okay. Because we are going to talk about that on Friday also. If you need to finish your test and want to do that now, you can also come see me. Use this time wisely. Let me know if you need my help or have questions.